Good morning, everyone. My name is Yasmeen Rahimi. I'm a senior research analyst here at Roth Capital Partners. It's really a pleasure to have Chris Schilling, founder and CEO of Acer Therapeutics, with us. Thank you for taking the time to be here. Before we get started, Chris, can you kindly share with us sort of how Acer was born and the history behind it, and we'll jump right into the additional questions.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Yas. So Acer started really born out of my time at BioMarin. So I spent 7 years there as the head of global commercial strategy and new product planning, and we spent a lot of time looking at assets to bring into the company that would plug in. They were de-risked assets that could plug into the commercial team since we had built out such a nice commercial infrastructure there. The company really wanted to focus on earlier R&D. These would be bigger programs that they could take from early development all the way through to commercialization. And so one of these opportunities I found that BioMarin was not interested in. It was a little too small for the company. We picked it up and spent a couple years developing it. The whole goal of Acer really was, again, to find these de-risked assets that we could reformulate or repurpose into areas of significant unmet medical need. And of course, there's over 7,000 orphan diseases that have, many of them don't have therapies. So my whole goal is really to form a company that we could take these products forward and provide them to patients that there's significant unmet medical need, and we could capitalize on that, move them into commercialization quickly.
Thank you. So can we spend briefly some time on what is your lead asset, what indication are you pursuing, and where are you in development?
Sure. So our lead asset is a drug called Edsavo. It's pre-NDA for the treatment of vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and specifically in patients who have a positive genetic mutation in the COL3A1 gene.
And how did you come across Edsavo, and then walk us through some of the existing data and that led to the filing of the NDA with the PDUFA date?
Sure. So I have a very good friend, Dr. Brendan Lee. He was a Howard Hughes medical investigator down at Baylor College of Medicine. He's now the chair of the Department of Genetics there. He approached me in 2014. This was after Acer had already been formed, and was interested to see if we wanted to pick up and develop another product that kind of fit the mold of what we were trying to do. And so he had commented that there was this drug in Europe that was being developed by an academic center, APHP, in France. And the whole idea was that they had demonstrated some very, very good data in the VEDS population using this drug, celiprolol, which was already commercially available in Europe for a different indication. So the cardiologists there at the hospital had actually taken it upon themselves. They realized that the drug had some very unique properties for which it was not approved for, and decided to study it in this population. They did this wonderful outcome study. It ended up being about 7 years that they followed these patients, but the primary endpoint was event-free survival after 4 years in the VEDS population. And so they randomized 53 patients either to drug or to no treatment, and then they were looking at time to first event in this patient population. And maybe I'll take a step back. The VEDS population specifically has this mutation in COL3A1, which is a gene that encodes collagen synthesis. And so these patients with VEDS do not produce a specific type of collagen in their blood vessels or their hollow organs like their intestines or the uterus. And so you can see that without having collagen in these tissues, you would have significant morbidity and mortality. So the investigators in France followed these patients. They were looking at time to first cardiovascular event, and the results of that study were that there was a nearly 70% reduction in your risk of either cardiovascular and or intestinal and uterine events at the end of 4 years.
So then once you had it in the registration process, you had to recollect and reanalyze the data from these 53 patients. Can you walk us a little bit more in detail in that regard so that the FDA require you and what that meant specifically?
Yep. Yeah. So interestingly, when Dr. Lee approached us about developing this product, we took the data was from the study was published in Lancet, and so we took the Lancet publication to the FDA, and we basically said, are you going to require us to do another study? What is going to be required if we do? And the FDA, for all intents and purposes, said, listen, we want you to go collect the primary source data from this study from Europe. Now, this was a study that was done at 9 sites throughout France and Belgium. It was done over a number of years in 53 patients. So there were mountains of data to collect. They also wanted us to go get the primary source data from the original dossier holder in Europe, Sanofi, and license the rights there. They did give us the opportunity to have some flexibility in the fact that they gave us a 505(b)(2) as opposed to a B1, a traditional NDA. But then we basically spent a year licensing the rights from Sanofi and from APHB, both to the rights to the data from the drug as well as rights to the data from the trial. And then it spent 2 years transcribing, translating, and moving all of the data from the trial into our own CRS for us to be able to perform our own statistical analyses on that data.
Thank you. And then during this time, there was also another study done by the Paris Registry following 144 UDS patients. Can you walk us through, has the FDA seen this data set? Do you need this data set for filing? And when should we anticipating the publication to come out to enlighten more efficacy and safety results of Idaceva?
Sure. So the publication in Lancet was done in 2010. And it was really around that time that the investigators in France said, listen, the benefit here is tremendous. Let's put all VEDS patients in France on the drug. And so there's over 400 patients in France with COL3A1 VEDS. They ensured that everyone had a positive genetic test in the registry, and then they began following those patients from about 2010 through 2017. And interestingly, they also collected retrospective data on these patients back to around 2000 or so. So the patient with the most data has 20 years worth of data in this registry. So the site, the main hospital in France, in Paris, Georges Pompidou, basically wrote a manuscript on their single-site experience within the registry on 144 COL3A1 positive patients. The manuscript was submitted to a top-tier journal early last year, and after a number of rounds of revision and review, the publication is pending. We don't have much additional detail on that, but it is in a top-tier journal, and we would expect that data would be available and published imminently.
Thank you. So can you remind us again for our audience the addressable market for VEDS in the U.S. And also help us as you're getting very close with your PDUFA say in June, how are you gearing up for your commercialization plan?
Yeah, so the NDA, actually I want to take one step back to the registry just to point out, so the BBEST study was event-free survival was the primary endpoint, and the registry they actually looked at mortality, overall survival, and they also looked at rate of hospitalization, so it's not the exact same data, they actually rounded out with some additional data. To the NDA. So we submitted the NDA in October of last year. It was accepted with priority review right before Christmas, and the PDUFA date is set for June 25th of this year. In order to get ready for commercialization, we're not doing anything that's, I think, fairly unique. We're trying to tackle the three main pillars that any ultra-orphan drug company is looking to do. So they're looking at commercialization of finding patients, within commercialization, getting centers of excellence up and running that can really optimize the outcomes for these patients and their care. And then lastly, within commercialization is access and pricing. We want to make sure that we have optimal access to the drug once it's available in the marketplace so that all patients with a COL3A1 gene positive mutation can go on this therapy and there's really no delay in getting them onto the drug.
And then what are you estimating is the addressable market of VEDS patients in the U.S.?
Yeah, so we believe that there's upwards of 5,000 patients that are COL3A1 positive. We know initially that there were about 2,000 patients in the genetic labs who have already been tested for COL3A1. We also know that this is an autosomal dominant disorder, and so we've talked with family members that often have anywhere between 5 and 15 members of their family that have COL3A1 positivity, and there's a lot of them who haven't gone in for testing as well. So what we'd like to do is a broad genetic testing panel that the company sponsors to identify other family members who may be COL3A1 positive as well. So that's where really the guidance we've been giving is anywhere between 2,000, which are currently known patients, upwards of around 5,000 patients once we get the genetic testing program up and running.
So what percentage of family members do you believe have not been tested, and what are reasons for not wanting to be tested at all?
Yeah, I think it's hard to pin down what percentage of family members have it. We know, for example, we talked with families where there's been a single patient who's been identified, and they've got probably 4 or 5, 6 other family members who are likely positive for COL3A1. We know others where there's maybe only 1 or 2 family members who may have it, and in certain cases, it may be a spontaneous mutation where there's no predisposition. So we really don't have a really good idea, but I think on average from the families we've spoken with, for every 1 known patient, there's probably 2 unknown patients within the family who are likely for COL3A1 positivity.
Thank you. And then maybe we haven't gotten into it, but what's the mechanism of action of Edisivo? What does it make? What is unique about it that allows to be, an effective treatment for VEDS patients?
Yeah, so as I alluded to earlier, the drug was originally approved in Europe for the treatment of hypertension, and this was back in the mid-1980s. At the time, it was known as a beta-1 antagonist because the drug has beta-1 antagonism. The reason why the French actually studied it in this population was because there were other mechanisms that were discovered between the mid-80s and the early 2000s, which included an alpha-2 antagonism, a beta-2 and beta-3 agonism, and it also independently upregulates endothelial nitric oxide synthase. And so all of this leads to the fact that this drug does a really nice job of inducing vasodilation and relaxing smooth muscle cells within the vessel wall. So if you think of it like a tube or a hose, you've got in VEDS patients a very small narrow hose that's very fragile. The walls are fragile. You put any pressure on it, those walls burst. But in the VEDS population, you're now inducing vasodilation, you're increasing the diameter of the vessel, and you're allowing the walls to relax a little bit more, absorb more of that energy, which we believe leads it to be less prone for rupture.
So what has been the feedback from physicians in regards to Edisivo, its unique properties versus other beta blockers? Obviously, Edisivo, Celaprol is available in Europe, not here in the U.S., and I'm certain they try to match it with other beta blockers. Can you share with us sort of the work that you've done to understand, the efficacy of other beta blockers on VEDS?
Yeah, so in Europe, these physicians have access to any and all drugs, cardiovascular drugs, and celiprolol has become the gold standard of care for VEDS patients throughout Europe. Now, keep in mind that the drug's only approved for hypertension and angina. It's not approved to treat VEDS anywhere in the world. So they use it off-label over there, and they have a choice to choose other drugs, and really no clinicians in Europe are making that choice, which leads me to believe that, from their clinical experience, that this drug has very unique properties, and again, is the treatment of choice in Europe. In the U.S., we've talked to the number of specialists, and it's their belief that the drug, that other beta blockers for which they have access to really are no better than placebo. Matter of fact, we had one leading opinion leader who basically said, if you guys are going to run another trial, feel free to use beta blockers because they don't do anything for these patients. So it's our belief right now that these drugs are not effective in VEDS. I think if you had hypertension within the disease, which very few patients do, it would likely lower their blood pressure, which would be a benefit. But outside that, in terms of the actual disease itself, there doesn't seem to be any additional benefit for using these drugs.
Thank you, Chris. So back in November, you had a VEDS advisory board. Can you share a little bit the feedback that you received at that point and how you're incorporating that into your commercial plan?
Sure. So we had an advisory board with 8 of the 50 centers that we intend to put into our network of excellence, and these are predominantly cardiovascular specialists. And it was an all-day meeting where we actually had the European investigators come over and present the data at that meeting. And basically the feedback was extremely positive. I think all of these clinicians were very, very interested in participating. They all wanted to have access and be a part of launching the drug in this population. They were very interested in studying this drug potentially in other diseases as well. So I would say unilaterally the feedback and the outcome of that was very, very positive. They were very interested in keeping in touch with the company as we have a potential launch for this drug later this year.
Thank you, Chris. So you came from BioMarin and brought wealth of knowledge with you. So can you describe to us what your pricing strategy is and how far you are in your sort of pricing discussion?
Yeah, we've actually done extensive pricing research around this drug, and so over the last couple of years, the feedback that we've received to date has been kind of interesting in the sense that most payers that we've spoken with expect the company to price this at ultra-orphan pricing given the population that's here. That's not the intent of the company. We characterize it as orphan pricing, meaning we would like to price the drug reasonably for this population for the benefit that's seen in terms of improvement in morbidity and mortality. We'd like to reinvest in this population to a significant degree. There's a lot of work to be done in this underserved population, as well as investing in our pipeline. So the feedback we've received from payers, we've kind of banded it in the sense that most payers, whether you're at 100,000 or 50,000 or 25,000, from their perspective in this ultra-orphan disease, they're not paying any attention to it. There's no additional benefit whether you're at 10,000 or 100,000. They're not going to make it easier or more difficult. In fact, they say it's going to cost them more to try to case manage if that was the case. So, and then when we tested higher prices, they basically said, listen, if you can keep it under $200,000, that's a really important number as well. So by and large, we're now kind of narrowed in that $100,000 to $200,000 per patient per year range to understand what the trade-offs are in terms of additional hindrance to access compared to the revenue that we can generate to again invest in the patient community in our pipeline.
Given that Idecivo, known as Celaprol, is available generic in Europe, is that a component that goes into the decision, into the payer discussions?
Not at all, as a matter of fact, no. I mean, most U.S. payers, the only thing that they care about is what's here in the U.S. They don't worry about, drugs approved elsewhere. That's just not their focus. It is the focus of, other key stakeholders, but payers, by and large, all they care about is that the drug is FDA approved and that there's benefit to these patients and that it's safe.
And then as you're very involved with the VADS advocacy groups, can you share a little bit the feedback that you're getting from them and how important it has been in your development? And then also a little bit on feedback, whether from physicians in Europe, if there are any U.S. patients who are traveling to Europe or other parts of the world to get Celaprol.
Yeah, so we've run 2 patient meetings. We've had an average of about 30 patients and their family members at each of these meetings. Those were both done last year. And then this year we're going to be having another patient meeting actually in about 2 weeks with another, I think, 32 patients are signed up for that. So we're very active on the patient front. We want their feedback. We've been very transparent with them, sharing our ideas and having them be a part of this process to help us think about what kind of support programs we can provide them and what additional work we can do within the community. So the feedback's been very, very positive. Keep in mind that these patients have no therapeutic options right now. Really, they have a catastrophic event. They have a rupture of their vasculature. They go into the emergency room to get it repaired, and then they go home and they're told, you just have to wait for the next one, and then the next one, and the next one, and eventually one will kill you. So the opportunity to have a prophylactic therapy that could reduce their event rate significantly, plus potentially other benefits, I think is very, very interesting to them. So they're very supportive and they're very interested in staying involved with the company. Regarding the second question you asked, whether these patients go abroad to access the drug, the short answer is no. I think in all the patients I've ever spoken with, there's probably less than 10 people over the last 5 years or so that I've spoken with that have actually gone abroad to receive the drug. And so right now it just doesn't seem that that's much of an access point for them or an option for them. And I'm not sure exactly why more aren't going to Europe because the drug looks so compelling, but at this time patients in the U.S. are not going abroad to get it.
Thank you. So maybe we can spend a little bit of time on ACER-001, which is being developed for urea cycle disorders. Can you walk us through its, mode of action and your plans for this year, next year, moving it forward?
Yep, so ACER-001 is a reformulation of a drug called sodium phenylbutyrate. This is already an FDA EMA-approved drug that Horizon Pharmaceuticals owns. So its branded names are Bufinol, that was the reference-listed drug, and then Ravicti. Bufinol, which was originally approved in the mid-1990s, it's a very effective drug at lowering ammonia in these urea cycle patients, but the taste is deplorable. So this is butyric acid. It's found in rancid butter and vomit. These patients take up to 20 grams of drug every day for the rest of their life. And so compliance on Bufinol was extremely poor. Enter Ravicti, and Ravicti was developed by a company called Hyperion just about 7 years ago, it was approved by the FDA, and it was a taste-masked prodrug, a slow-release formulation of phenylbutyrate. So it's actually quite a good drug for these patients in urea cycle, but the price of the drug has now increased to nearly $900,000 per patient per year. So the top thought leaders in patient advocacy actually reached out to us asking us if we'd be interested in developing our formulation, which is taste-masked immediate release, for the urea cycle population. We said we would. So for us, it's simply doing a bridge study, comparing, since the PK is going to be comparable to Bufenil. We just need to compare this drug against Bufenil in the right population, and we'll file an NDA shortly thereafter, hopefully within the next 12 months or so.
Thank you. And you recently had an acquisition of an additional asset. Walk us through its mechanism of action, and what are your plans forward, and when would you be unveiling additional indication that you're pursuing?
Yeah, so we licensed in the beginning of this year, we licensed in a drug called Asanitant from Sanofi. We had obviously had a good relationship with them from our deal with Adcevo. They were quite impressed with the development that we had undertaken with that program, and so they were very interested in partnering with us with Asanitant. So we obtained worldwide rights to the drug. This was a compound that was actually developed and studied in the 90s and early 2000s. It's a neurokinin 3 receptor antagonist, a very potent one. It's actually the reference drug within this class. And it was originally studied for treatment of schizophrenia. So it was put in over 1,000 people to determine the safety and the efficacy. What they ultimately determined coming out of phase 2 was that the drug and its mechanism was not particularly relevant in schizophrenia, so they shelved the program in 2005. In the last couple of years, there have been 2 additional NK3R antagonists that have moved back into the clinic, but they've been repurposed into neuroendocrine disorders. So looking at diseases like postmenopausal women with vasomotor symptoms. These are like hot flashes, irritability. And then you have polycystic ovarian syndrome. So the drug, the NK3 receptor, is found in the hypothalamus in the brain. It's actually at the source of an axis that they call the hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, which regulates the synthesis of all sex hormones, so estrogens and androgens. And so the two companies that were developing it studied it in these vasomotor symptoms in PCOS, and they found remarkable reductions in those symptoms within 4 weeks, about 90% reductions. And in PCOS, within 12 weeks, they found about 98% reductions in those symptoms. The one compound that was developed by Molendo was shelved for toxicity purposes. The other drug, which was being developed by a European company, was acquired by Astellas in 2017, and they'll be reporting phase 2B data in a little over 350 patients next week at ENDO, the conference. And so we're looking forward to seeing that data to see whether that supports and justifies going into these type of diseases. Now, I'll point out that Acer is a rare disease company that is interested in either rare diseases or diseases that have life-threatening issues with them, all with significant unmet medical needs. So we have no intention of going into menopause, let's say. But that axis, the HPG axis, is involved in a number of other rare and life-threatening diseases. And right now we're working with top thought leaders in the U.S. To determine what are the best indications and what is the prioritization of those. And we should be having those meetings next month. And so coming out of that, we'd like to share that data probably in the July timeframe, where we should have greater clarity on exactly what our development plan will look like going forward.
Thank you. And then can you just maybe remind us of your current cash and expected runway? And then as well, sort of what are the bearish views on Acer?
Yep. So our cash that we reported at the end of the year is $41.7 million. That's enough cash to get us into the first half of 2020. And so that allows us to launch Adcevo, assuming that it's approved, and do some basic development work on ACER-001 on Asanitant. Obviously, if we want to accelerate development, we'll be looking at other ways to, further fund those programs, so we can get those moving along a little bit quicker. But I think, what was the second question? Sorry.
In regards to bearish views or pushback you're getting from investors.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for the bearish view right now is just it's a binary event, right? Does this drug get approved or doesn't it get approved? Is the FDA likely to come back on us and ask us to do an additional study or something like that? All indications suggest that we've had very positive interactions with the FDA, and so we don't think that that's a likelihood, but you never know, it's the FDA. So we continue to work very closely with them to move this forward. But outside that, the bearish thesis, I think, is it's just binary at this point. All eyes are on Edsavo, and the goal is simply to get this drug approved. I guess the only other question would be, are we prepared to commercialize this drug ourselves? And the answer is yes. Given my background and the team that we've assembled, we've just hired a head of sales, a head of MSLs, and we're building out the commercial teams fully in preparation of a potential launch in third quarter this year.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for a great discussion. I'm going to open it up for questions for our audience. Okay. Yes. Can you turn off the microphone? Okay. No, go ahead.
Okay. In Europe, Edsavo in Europe as a beta antagonist?
Correct. That's where it was approved, was as a beta antagonist.
And a doctor can't prescribe that in the U.S. Of course, this is not approved in the U.S. Is anybody working on that drug as a beta antagonist in the U.S.?
They are not.
Trials going to bring that drug over?
Yeah, it's a great question. The answer is no. And primarily, I think it's because that there was actually an NDA submitted by Sanofi back in the late 1980s for the treatment of hypertension. I mean, the plan was for this to be a third-generation cardioselective beta blocker that was, really the best in class. But they found that the drug wasn't very effective because of those other mechanisms were kind of getting in the way. So even in Europe, it kind of went away. Sanofi in the in the U.S., they submitted an NDA in 1987, and basically the FDA, we just found this out from a guy who was in regulatory there. He came back and said that the FDA, the director of the cardiorenal division at the time, said, listen, guys, your data is not that compelling in hypertension, I'll be honest with you. It's probably not going to get approved here. I'd compel you guys to pull your application in hypertension here. That's what they did.
The remote risk would be this drug would become approved in the U.S., not your drug, but some of these drugs go through the U.S., and then it would just be prescribed off-label at a much lower price.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could be a theoretical. That's one that we were looking at earlier on. It's very remote, and we have, licensed the rights from Sanofi for their entire dossier to support it. So people who are interested in being able to do that would actually have to go and generate the non-clinical PK, PD, and cardiovascular studies to support the application. I think within the window that will be on the marketplace commercially, I think that's probably a very slim dimension. That's a good question.
Thank you so much. We'll give any questions for a few minutes afterwards. So, thank you.